Welcome to the Land to Lots podcast, powered by Launch Development Finance Advisors. And now your host, Carter Froelich.
Welcome everybody to the Land to Lots podcast, and I'm really happy to welcome back to the program Tim Green. As you recall, Tim Green is a director at the law firm of Coates Rose, and Tim has been assisting the private sector in matters of public finance for a number of years. And for anybody who has a project in Texas, obviously you've heard of Tim Green. Tim, welcome to the show. Welcome back. We're glad to have you back on another episode of Land to Lots. How are you today?
I'm great and looking forward to this discussion.
Great. And remember last time we were discussing PIDs, we were just talking in general terms. What is a PID? What it can be used for? What are the benefits of utilizing a PID for a project in Texas? Today, I'd like to go to class 201, whereas before we were, in our PID 101 class. But oftentimes in the state of Texas, when we're seeing the use of a PID, which is a public improvement district, we're oftentimes using the PID in conjunction with a TIRZ or a tax increment reinvestment zone. And what I'd like to explore on today's program, Tim, is how does the PID and the TIRZ work together? Why is that beneficial? What type of projects can a PID and a TIRZ combination be used for? Just some really high-level discussion points related to the PID and the TIRZ. So maybe we start, on a 40,000-foot view and start to drill down. But let's first start with, what is a TIRZ, Tim?
A TIRZ, or sometimes it is referred to as a TIF, and you'd be surprised how many people think that TIF is different than a TIRZ, but they are two terms for the exact same thing. A TIRZ is a tax increment reinvestment zone, which is a zone that can be created by a city or a county. And it is, and I describe this to clients all the time, it is basically a line drawn on a piece of paper by the city, by the county, more often the city than the county. And then the city comes in and says, we will pull off from the growth in the tax base in this area a portion of the ad valorem taxes, and they can do the sales tax as well. They can pull that money off and put it into a fund, and then they can use that fund to either reimburse the developer, incentivize the developer, issue bonds. They can do a number of things with it. But they can also then, when they create the TIRZ, they are required to reach out to all the other taxing jurisdictions that levy ad valorem taxes or sales tax in that area within the line drawn on the piece of paper, and ask those governmental entities if they want to participate as well in the TIRZ and pay that increment into the project fund. And each taxing entity can decide on its own, do they want to participate, how much do they want to participate by, and how long they want to participate. That, in essence, is how a TIRZ works.
Is there a time limit for a TIRZ by statute or Texas code? Or what have you seen as a matter of practice, Tim?
There is not a statutory minimum or maximum. I think what I've seen probably most common is something in the 30 to 45 year range. I've seen them as short as 15 years. I don't know that I've seen them longer than 45 years, and they can be, the term of them can be extended during the life of the TIRZ. All you have to do is get each of the taxing entities that wishes to participate to agree to extend the life of the TIRZ, or if any of them do, then it can be extended for purposes of that taxing entity.
Boy, you packed a lot into that. I've got some more follow-up questions, but since we're talking about the term, And we haven't yet talked about the combining the PID and the TERS, but I would assume if you are in fact combining a PID, issuing assessment bonds through the PID and potentially subsidizing the PID assessment payment with a TERS, that you would want to make sure that your TERS is lining up with what you expect to be the time period in which your PID bonds would be outstanding. Is that a correct statement?
You are correct, and that is something that ends up getting discussed multiple times with the city. And the reason for that is that if you have an area that's within the PID and is within the TERS, and it's going to be developed in multiple phases, then what you typically find is when you develop phase one, the PID assessment is typically for 30 years. So you want the TERS contribution for that phase to match up with the life of the PID bonds. And so you may do a PID bond financing for phase one that's 30 years. And then when you move into phase two, let's say it's 3 years later, and you want to do a similar financing that's another 30 years, then that's a total of 33. If you extend that out over 4 or 5 phases, and then you want to build in some time frame in case there's a down cycle in the economy, you end up going back to the city or the county, whoever is creating the TERS, and saying, I want this to be a 40, 45, 50-year life of the TERS, but oh, by the way, I'm only going to ask you to participate or contribute the increment from phase one for a term that matches up those PID bonds, and then for phase two for the term of those PID bonds, which when we talk to the city, we don't like to talk about a 45 or 50-year TERS because that just sounds so long.
Yeah.
I always use the term, it's really a rolling 30-year TERS.
And that is such an important point. I hope our listeners are really grasping this, not only from, the mechanics of how the PID and TERS work, but also on how one might want to present that. And Tim, that's where your expertise and your experience really comes in and is important as how we package these financings and present them to the city. So that was a great point.
Well, I can assure you it sells much better with the city if you talk about a rolling 30-year TERS than walk in and say, I want a 45 or 50-year TERS, and then have to explain it from there.
Exactly, because all they hear is I should say, the jurisdiction will not be receiving its property and or sales tax increment for 45 years. When in reality, when you show them the math, that is not necessarily the case. And
That's right.
we're
correct.
often doing that. And once they understand it, they get it, but automatically they have a tendency to react negatively.
And let's also talk about the fact that when we say the city and the other taxing jurisdictions are going to participate in the TERS, you get to negotiate with them and they get to decide how much of their tax increment they're willing to participate. So I don't want anybody to think that we're talking about the city giving 100% of their tax increment to the TERS project fund. Typically, you negotiate that with the city.
And that's a key point too. And in your negotiations, and I can share with you what we see, but are you usually seeing a jurisdiction, be it a county or a city, saying, we'll give you, I'm just making up a number, 20% of our property tax? Or are they saying, hey, we'll give you 15 cents, 20 cents, whatever that number may work out to be, and making it a dollar amount, meaning 20 cents? Or is it a percentage typically of what their then property tax or sales tax collections may be?
I've seen both. I would tell you what's most common that I've seen is a percentage. And the percentage would be something like the city agrees to contribute 40% of the tax increment within the TERS to the TERS project fund, so that if the tax rate goes up, that number goes up. If that tax rate goes down, that number goes down. And I'm sure the cities is thinking that over time their tax rate's going to go down, which I think is why they're probably reticent to commit to a fixed number.
Yep. And that's what we've seen the most of too, as a percentage. So if their tax rate does change, they're not locked into something. So you'd mentioned the agencies, and what has been your experience? Have you ever gotten a school district to be willing to contribute to a TERS, Tim?
I have not, and I know there's been a lot of law on it. The long and the short of it is, I think that the school districts, if they participate in the TERS, it has some impact on their ability to get money from the state and the calculation of that. And so therefore the school districts are very reticent to contribute anything to the TERS. I've never had one do it so far.
Yeah, and that would be our experience as well. I mean, it's to the point where we don't even really bother asking. We're just looking primarily at the county and the city, and that's going to lead me into the next conversation related to where these can be done. In our experience, we've seen most of the TERS and as combined with the PID when we're in the ETJ, and the city is wanting us to annex into the city's boundaries. Do you want to add any more color on, where the TERS can be done, and in some of your experiences where you may have seen them in different jurisdictions and in different formats?
Well, the scenario you described is probably what I've seen most frequently.
Mm-hmm.
And that is that the property is in the extraterritorial jurisdiction of the city. Because of recent changes in state law, the cities cannot annex that area. It can only be annexed on the voluntary petition of the landowner. So the city is interested in incentivizing that landowner to bringing his property into the city. The city has the authority to create a TER or a PID in the city's corporate limits or ETJ. And they can also create a TERS in their corporate limits or ETJ. So in order to incentivize the developer to bring his property into the city's corporate limits, the city says, I will cooperatively create the PID, create the TERS. I will contribute the negotiated percentage of TERS contribution that the city will provide in exchange for the developer annexing that property into the city. And typically what is a part of that negotiation is an agreement related to the way that property is going to be developed. So in particular, the parties will typically negotiate the lot sizes, the density, and the type of land use, all of which will be memorialized in what we call a 212-172 agreement, which is the reference to the section of the Texas Local Government Code that applies to that. And the benefit of that agreement is it specifically says it's an agreement that can be entered into between the city and a landowner whose land is in the ETJ, that they can agree on land use issues and other issues related to the development. And then when that property is annexed into the city, the law says that agreement will be enforceable after the property is annexed into the city and enforceable against future city councils. So that is a good vehicle for the parties where the developer wants to develop he owns the land in the ETJ. He wants the benefit of a PID. He needs the benefit of the TERS so that they can negotiate it being brought into the city. The city creates the PID and the TERS, and then the level of participation under which the city will contribute money through the TERS.
Mm-hmm.
Very common scenario.
Yeah. And I know we talked about this a little bit prior to the call, but what is the range of typical city participation in a TERS as a percentage of, let's just start with property tax and then sales tax as a percentage of what would be generated through the annexation?
My experience, I would say typically, and again, most of it is driven by single-family residential development, although there certainly can be a commercial component. But I'd say what I typically see is a participation by the city of something between 30% of the city's ad valorem tax increment to 65%.
Mm-hmm.
I have seen some that are fixed, like 19 and a half cents, which probably equated to about 40% of the city tax rate. I've heard of them as high as 75%. I've seen them as low as a nickel. But most of them are, I think, in that 30, 35, 50, 60, 65%, because that seems to be the percentage of participation that you need from the city to make all the numbers work once you add the city tax burden on top of it.
Yeah, and I think that's a key point as to why the cities are willing to offer the TERS. And for our listeners, once you're moving in from the county in or the ETJ into the city's corporate boundaries, you are having to go and pick up the additional ad valorem property taxes that the city is charging. Therefore, your tax rate moves up from where you would be if you were to develop in the county. And so to offset that, the cities are willing to provide the TERS to minimize or reduce for a period of time the impact of the city's ad valorem tax. The one thing I'd like to just mention too, Tim, and to our readers or listeners, excuse me, is that we've attached to the show notes a high level PID bond sizing, comparing that to a PID plus a TERS subsidy bond sizing, and then also compared it to a third scenario, which would be a PID bond along with a TERS that just comes in over time. It's not subsidizing a larger PID bond, but it is just revenue that's coming in to fund TERS eligible infrastructure. So please download the link to the show notes, and you'll be able to see the math behind what Tim and I are talking about here today. One to drill down a little further, Tim, on the percentages. Once the city and a land developer have agreed to the percentage that they're willing to provide through the TERS, does the county usually follow through with the same amount, or is it different, or does it just kind of vary depending upon location, project, developer, etc.?
My experience is it varies, and from my perspective, I'm always curious as to why the county doesn't participate more. Because if the property is going to be annexed into the city, then the city is going to provide all of the police, fire, EMS, and public services. So the county is really getting a benefit from this development without having to provide the public services that are typical. But they seem to have their own policies and they seem to have their own motivation. I've had counties come in and say, well, I'll participate if the average price home is X or above, because I guess they're trying to incentivize the increase in the price of homes in the area. I've seen them talk about other public policies that they have, but it seems to me to be the county kind of makes its own decision. Although I'm sure that if the city is going to contribute, something like 50%, then the county feels somewhat compelled to do something somewhat similar.
Yeah.
So they're not identical. They probably run in a parallel path, but your conversation with the county is a totally different conversation.
And in your experience, are you finding it better to negotiate with the city first and then the county, or do it simultaneously? Is it typically done simultaneously? What works in your experience the best for the private sector?
My experience is to start with the city, because that's normally who you're dealing with first, because either the land's in the city corporate limits or the city wants it brought into the corporate limits. So when you sit down and you negotiate, you say, okay, here are the conditions under which either A, I can develop, or B, I can bring it into the city. And what I like to do is have the client run their numbers and come up and say, here's the total TIR's participation I need. And then city, I can get it from you, I can get it from the county, I can get it from all the taxing jurisdictions. It doesn't matter, but this is what I need. And so you somewhat motivate and incentivize the city to be your ally in going to the county and getting the county to participate, because the way the city sees it is the more I can get the county to participate, then the less I have to.
Yep. And we oftentimes prepare the fiscal and economic impact so that, first of all, the private sector can understand what those numbers are. But more importantly, the jurisdictions begin to have an understanding as to what the sales tax, what the property tax increment, what the fees and permits will be, and over the life of the project. So they understand at the end of the day what the fiscal and economic benefit is to that tax engagement.
And just because I go to the city first doesn't mean we don't go to the county quickly.
Yeah.
It's not like you wait till the end of it to then reach out to the county. We try to do that as quickly as possible, but what we try to do is get the city to be our ally and motivate them to help us pitch it to the county.
Well, everybody, that concludes part one of Tim Green's discussion of PIDTIR's financings. Stay tuned for our next podcast, where we get into the financial benefit of using the PIDTIR's combination as it relates to financing eligible infrastructure. See you next time. Thank you.
You have been listening to the Land to Lots podcast with Carter Froelich. Tune in for the next episode.